Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about compounded losses. So when you think about compounded returns, you often think about the gains, right? So for example, the S&P 500, it's done 7.5% adjusted for inflation since 1945. Unadjusted for inflation, it's done 11.4%. And when you look at a calculator like this, you can see if somebody puts in $100,000, as a lump sum plus 5,000 a year, which is just over 400 a month, and they get 9.5% with a assumed inflation rate of 3%. The end balance is close to 4 million, and adjusted for inflation is just over 1.2 million, despite the fact that these figures are more conservative actually than these historical figures. However, what a lot of people don't realize is compounding works in the other way as well. So when it comes to money in the bank, it's a loss to inflation. People know that, but what they don't know is how quickly it compounds. So for example, let's take the example of last year. So the UK had an inflation rate of about 5%, the US about 7%. And money in the bank, usually you could get 0.1%. So if a year ago, somebody had left 100,000 in the bank, getting 0.1% for 1 year, and the inflation rate, let's just say, is 5.5%, more similar to the UK rate than the US rate. You can see this year their effective purchasing power would be 6,000 less than last year. But people don't really notice that. That's why inflation is called the silent killer of money, because people don't psychologically notice that kind of dip. However, what's interesting is if something happens for a long period of time, it really starts to eat away at your return. So let's increase this to 13 years, 14 in fact. The reason I've chose 14 is that interest rates have been pretty much zero since 2008, which is about 14 years ago now, 2007, 2008. So since that time period, typically speaking, people have made 0.1% in many European, Japanese, and UK banks, and the inflation rate on average has been about 3%. So if somebody would have left their money in the bank in many developed countries since the financial crisis, their effective loss of purchasing power has been 1/3 of what they put in. And if the next 14 years are the same as the previous 14 years, which we can't guarantee, you can see that the effective loss of purchasing power is more than half. And if this continues for even longer, let's say a career of 40 years, you can see that somebody has lost more than 2/3 of their purchasing power. So a lot of people talk about compounding, but for compounded returns. A lot of people also know that putting your money in the bank is a loss to inflation. But what a lot of people don't realize is over time, that loss really compounds. But people don't really realize it. When they tend to realize it, though, is in a place like Turkey more recently, or Venezuela or Argentina. If something is sudden, so for example, in a place like Turkey, many people are looking at something like this. They may be looking at like 14%, but they're looking at a situation where the inflation rate or loss of currency is something like this. When something like that happens, people really stand up and take notice because they think, wow, this is sudden. The Turkish lira was 2-1 against the dollar 8 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever. Now it's 13-1, and they panic. But when it comes to most developed countries, that seldom happens. So inflation is a very slow and silent killer, because if you're losing 2 or 3% every single year to inflation, and occasionally, like last year, might be 4 or 5%, it takes time for you to really feel that loss of purchasing power.